Chapter 3. Such are those thick and gloomy shadows damp, oft seen in charnel-vaults and sepulchres, lingering and sitting by a new-made grave. Milton. On the following day, Montoni sent a second excuse to Emily, who was surprised at the circumstance. "This is very strange," said she to herself. "His conscience tells him the purport of my visit, and he defers it to avoid an explanation." She now almost resolved to throw herself in his way, but terror checked the intention, and this day passed as the preceding one with Emily, except that a degree of awful expectation concerning the approaching night now somewhat disturbed the dreadful calmness that had pervaded her mind. Towards evening, the second part of the band, which had made the first excursion among the mountains, returned to the castle, where, as they entered the courts, Emily, in her remote chamber, heard their loud shouts and strains of exultation, like the orgies of furies over some horrid sacrifice. She even feared they were about to commit some barbarous deed, a conjecture from which, however, Annette soon relieved her by telling that the people were only exulting over the plunder they had brought with them. This circumstance still further confirmed her in the belief that Montoni had really commenced to be a captain of banditti, and meant to retrieve his broken fortunes by the plunder of travellers. Indeed, when she considered all the circumstances of his situation, in an armed and almost inaccessible castle, retired far among the recesses of wild and solitary mountains, along whose distant skirts were scattered towns and cities, whither wealthy travellers were continually passing, this appeared to be the situation of all others most suited for the success of schemes of rapine, and she yielded to the strange thought that Montoni was become a captain of robbers. His character also, unprincipled, dauntless, cruel, and enterprising, seemed to fit him for the situation. Delighting in the tumult and in the struggles of life, he was equally a stranger to pity and to fear. His very courage was a sort of animal ferocity, not the noble impulse of a principle, such as inspirits the mind against the oppressor in the cause of the oppressed, but a constitutional hardiness of nerve that cannot feel, and that therefore cannot fear. Emily's supposition, however natural, was in part erroneous, for she was a stranger to the state of this country, and to the circumstances under which its frequent wars were partly conducted. The revenues of the many states of Italy being at that time insufficient to the support of standing armies, even during the short periods which the turbulent habits both of the governments and the people permitted to pass in peace, an order of men arose, not known in our age, and but faintly described in the history of their own. Of the soldiers disbanded at the end of every war, few returned to the safe but unprofitable occupations then usual in peace. Sometimes they passed into other countries and mingled with armies which still kept the field. Sometimes they formed themselves into bands of robbers and occupied remote fortresses, where their desperate character, the weakness of the governments which they offended, and the certainty that they could be recalled to the armies when their presence should be again wanted, prevented them from being much pursued by the civil power, and sometimes they attached themselves to the fortunes of a popular chief, by whom they were led into the service of any state which could settle with them the price of their valor. From this latter practice arose their name, condottieri, a term formidable all over Italy for a period, which concluded in the earlier part of the 17th century, but of which it is not so easy to ascertain the commencement. Contests between the smaller states were then, for the most part, affairs of enterprise alone, and the probabilities of success were estimated not from the skill, but from the personal courage of the general and the soldiers. The ability which was necessary to the conduct of tedious operations was little valued. It was enough to know how a party might be led towards their enemies with the greatest secrecy, or conducted from them in the compactest order. The officer was to precipitate himself into a situation where, but for his example, the soldiers might not have ventured, and as the opposed parties knew little of each other's strength, the event of the day was frequently determined by the boldness of the first movements. In such services the condottieri were eminent, and in these, where plunder always followed success, their characters acquired a mixture of intrepidity and profligacy, which awed even those whom they served. When they were not thus engaged, their chief had usually his own fortress, in which or in its neighbourhood they enjoyed an irksome rest, and though their wants were at one time partly supplied from the property of the inhabitants, the lavish distribution of their plunder at others prevented them from being obnoxious, and the peasants of such districts gradually shared the character of their warlike visitors. The neighbouring governments sometimes professed, but seldom endeavoured, to suppress these military communities, both because it was difficult to do so, and because a disguised protection of them ensured for the service of their wars a body of men who could not otherwise be so cheaply maintained or so perfectly qualified. The commanders sometimes even relied so far upon this policy of the several powers as to frequent their capitals, and Montoni, having met them in the gaming parties of Venice and Padua, conceived a desire to emulate their characters before his ruined fortunes tempted him to adopt their practices. It was for the arrangement of his present plan of life that the midnight councils were held at his mansion in Venice, and at which Orsino and some other members of the present community then assisted with suggestions which they had since executed with the wreck of their fortunes. On the return of night, Emily resumed her station at the casement. There was now a moon, and as it rose over the tufted woods, its yellow light served to show the lonely terrace and the surrounding objects more distinctly than the twilight of the stars had done, and promised Emily to assist her observations should the mysterious form return. On this subject she again wavered in conjecture, and hesitated whether to speak to the figure, to which a strong and almost irresistible interest urged her, but terror, at intervals, made her reluctant to do so. "If this is a person who has designs upon the castle," said she, "my curiosity may prove fatal to me. Yet the mysterious music and the lamentations I heard must surely have proceeded from him. If so, he cannot be an enemy." She then thought of her unfortunate aunt, and, shuddering with grief and horror, the suggestions of imagination seized her mind with all the force of truth, and she believed that the form she had seen was supernatural. She trembled, breathed with difficulty, an icy coldness touched her cheeks, and her fears for a while overcame her judgment. Her resolution now forsook her, and she determined, if the figure should appear, not to speak to it. Thus the time passed, as she sat at her casement, awed by expectation, and by the gloom and stillness of midnight. For she saw obscurely in the moonlight only the mountains and woods, a cluster of towers that formed the west angle of the castle, and the terrace below, and heard no sound, except now and then the lonely watchword passed by the sentinels on duty, and afterwards the steps of the men who came to relieve guard, and whom she knew at a distance on the rampart by their pikes that glittered in the moonbeam, and then by the few short words in which they hailed their fellows of the night. Emily retired within her chamber while they passed the casement. When she returned to it, all was again quiet. It was now very late. She was wearied with watching, and began to doubt the reality of what she had seen on the preceding night. But she still lingered at the window, for her mind was too perturbed to admit of sleep. The moon shone with a clear lustre that afforded her a complete view of the terrace, but she saw only a solitary sentinel pacing at one end of it, and at length, tired with expectation, she withdrew to seek rest. Such, however, was the impression left on her mind by the music and the complaining she had formerly heard, as well as by the figure which she fancied she had seen, that she determined to repeat the watch on the following night. Montoni, on the next day, took no notice of Emily's appointed visit, but she, more anxious than before to see him, sent Annette to inquire at what hour he would admit her. He mentioned 11 o'clock, and Emily was punctual to the moment, at which she called up all her fortitude to support the shock of his presence and the dreadful recollections it enforced. He was with several of his officers in the cedar room, on observing whom she paused, and her agitation increased, while he continued to converse with them, apparently not observing her, till some of his officers, turning round, saw Emily and uttered an exclamation. She was hastily retiring when Montoni's voice arrested her, and in a faltering accent she said, "I would speak with you, Signor Montoni, if you are at leisure." "These are my friends," he replied. "Whatever you would say, they may hear." Emily, without replying, turned from the rude gaze of the chevaliers, and Montoni then followed her to the hall, whence he led her to a small room, of which he shut the door with violence. As she looked on his dark countenance, she again thought she saw the murderer of her aunt, and her mind was so convulsed with horror that she had not power to recall thought enough to explain the purport of her visit, and to trust herself with the mention of Madame Montoni was more than she dared. Montoni at length impatiently inquired what she had to say. "I have no time for trifling," he added. "My moments are important." Emily then told him that she wished to return to France, and came to beg that he would permit her to do so. But when he looked surprised, and inquired for the motive of her request, she hesitated, became paler than before, trembled, and had nearly sunk at his feet. He observed her emotion with apparent indifference, and interrupted the silence by telling her he must be gone. Emily, however, recalled her spirits sufficiently to enable her to repeat her request, and when Montoni absolutely refused it, her slumbering mind was roused. "I can no longer remain here with propriety, sir," said she, "and I may be allowed to ask by what right you detain me." "It is my will that you remain here," said Montoni, laying his hand on the door to go. "Let that suffice you." Emily, considering that she had no appeal from his will, forbore to dispute his right, and made a feeble effort to persuade him to be just. "While my aunt lived, sir," said she in a tremulous voice, "my residence here was not improper, but now that she is no more, I may surely be permitted to depart. My stay cannot benefit you, sir, and will only distress me." "Who told you that Madame Montoni was dead?" said Montoni with an inquisitive eye. Emily hesitated, for nobody had told her so, and she did not dare to avow the having seen that spectacle in the portal chamber which had compelled her to the belief. "Who told you so?" he repeated more sternly. "Alas, I know it too well," replied Emily. "Spare me on this terrible subject." She sat down on a bench to support herself. "If you wish to see her," said Montoni, "you may. She lies in the east turret." He now left the room, without awaiting her reply, returned to the cedar chamber, where such of the chevaliers as had not before seen Emily began to rally him on the discovery they had made. But Montoni did not appear disposed to bear this mirth, and they changed the subject. Having talked with the subtle Orsino on the plan of an excursion, which he meditated for a future day, his friend advised that they should lie in wait for the enemy, which Verezzi impetuously opposed, reproached Orsino with want of spirit, and swore that if Montoni would let him lead on 50 men, he would conquer all that should oppose him. Orsino smiled contemptuously. Montoni smiled too, but he also listened. Verezzi then proceeded with vehement declamation and assertion till he was stopped by an argument of Orsino, which he knew not how to answer better than by invective. His fierce spirit detested the cunning caution of Orsino, whom he constantly opposed, and whose inveterate though silent hatred he had long ago incurred. And Montoni was a calm observer of both, whose different qualifications he knew, and how to bend their opposite character to the perfection of his own designs. But Verezzi, in the heat of opposition, now did not scruple to accuse Orsino of cowardice, at which the countenance of the latter, while he made no reply, was overspread with a livid paleness. and Montoni, who watched his lurking eye, saw him put his hand hastily into his bosom. But Verezzi, whose face, glowing with crimson, formed a striking contrast to the complexion of Orsino, remarked not the action, and continued boldly declaiming against cowards to Cavigni, who was slyly laughing at his vehemence and at the silent mortification of Orsino, when the latter, retiring a few steps behind, drew forth a stiletto to stab his adversary in the back. Montoni arrested his half-extended arm, and, with a significant look, made him return the poniard into his bosom, unseen by all except himself, for most of the party were disputing at a distant window on the situation of a dell where they meant to form an ambuscade. When Verezzi had turned round, the deadly hatred expressed on the features of his opponent raising for the first time a suspicion of his intention, he laid his hand on his sword, and then, seeming to recollect himself, strode up to Montoni. "Signor," said he, with a significant look at Orsino, "we are not a band of assassins. If you have business for brave men, employ me on this expedition. You shall have the last drop of my blood. If you have only work for cowards, keep him," pointing to Orsino, "and let me quit Udolpho." Orsino, still more incensed, again drew forth his stiletto and rushed towards Verezzi, who, at the same instant, advanced with his sword, when Montoni and the rest of the party interfered and separated them. "This is the conduct of a boy," said Montoni to Verezzi, "not of a man. Be more moderate in your speech." "Moderation is the virtue of cowards," retorted Verezzi. "They are moderate in everything but in fear." "I accept your words," said Montoni, turning upon him with a fierce and haughty look, and drawing his sword out of the scabbard. "With all my heart," cried Verezzi, "though I did not mean them for you." He directed a pass at Montoni, and while they fought, the villain Orsino made another attempt to stab Verezzi, and was again prevented. The combatants were at length separated, and, after a very long and violent dispute, reconciled. Montoni then left the room with Orsino, whom he detained in private consultation for a considerable time. Emily, meanwhile, stunned by the last words of Montoni, forgot for the moment his declaration that she should continue in the castle while she thought of her unfortunate aunt, who, he had said, was laid in the east turret. In suffering the remains of his wife to lie thus long unburied, there appeared a degree of brutality more shocking than she had suspected even Montoni could practise. After a long struggle, she determined to accept his permission to visit the turret and to take a last look of her ill-fated aunt, with which design she returned to her chamber, and while she waited for Annette to accompany her, endeavoured to acquire fortitude sufficient to support her through the approaching scene. For though she trembled to encounter it, she knew that to remember the performance of this last act of duty would hereafter afford her consoling satisfaction. Annette came, and Emily mentioned her purpose, from which the former endeavoured to dissuade her, though without effect, and Annette was, with much difficulty, prevailed upon to accompany her to the turret, but no consideration could make her promise to enter the chamber of death. They now left the corridor, and having reached the foot of the staircase, which Emily had formerly ascended, Annette declared she would go no further, and Emily proceeded alone. When she saw the track of blood which she had before observed, her spirits fainted, and, being compelled to rest on the stairs, she almost determined to proceed no further. The pause of a few moments restored her resolution, and she went on. As she drew near the landing-place, upon which the upper chamber opened, she remembered that the door was formerly fastened, and apprehended that it might still be so. In this expectation, however, she was mistaken, for the door opened at once into a dusky and silent chamber, round which she fearfully looked, and then slowly advanced, when a hollow voice spoke. Emily, who was unable to speak or to move from the spot, uttered no sound of terror. The voice spoke again, and then, thinking that it resembled that of Madame Montoni, Emily's spirits were instantly roused. She rushed towards a bed that stood in a remote part of the room, and drew aside the curtains. Within appeared a pale and emaciated face. She started back, then again advanced, shuddered as she took up the skeleton hand that lay stretched upon the quilt, then let it drop, and then viewed the face with a long unsettled gaze. It was that of Madame Montoni, though so changed by illness that the resemblance of what it had been could scarcely be traced in what it now appeared. She was still alive, and, raising her heavy eyes, she turned them on her niece. "Where have you been so long?" said she, in the same hollow tone. "I thought you had forsaken me." "Do you indeed live?" said Emily at length, "or is this but a terrible apparition?" She received no answer, and again she snatched up the hand. "This is substance," she exclaimed, "but it is cold, cold as marble." She let it fall. "Oh, if you really live, speak," said Emily in a voice of desperation, "that I may not lose my senses. Say you know me." "I do live," replied Madame Montoni, "but I feel that I am about to die." Emily clasped the hand she held more eagerly and groaned. They were both silent for some moments. Then Emily endeavored to soothe her, and inquired what had reduced her to this present deplorable state. Montoni, when he removed her to the turret under the improbable suspicion of having attempted his life, had ordered the men employed on the occasion to observe a strict secrecy concerning her. To this he was influenced by a double motive. He meant to debar her from the comfort of Emily's visits, and to secure an opportunity of privately dispatching her, should any new circumstances occur to confirm the present suggestions of his suspecting mind. His consciousness of the hatred he deserved, it was natural enough should at first lead him to attribute to her the attempt that had been made upon his life. And though there was no other reason to believe that she was concerned in that atrocious design, his suspicions remained. He continued to confine her in the turret under a strict guard, and without pity or remorse had suffered her to lie forlorn and neglected under a raging fever till it had reduced her to the present state. The track of blood which Emily had seen on the stairs had flowed from the unbound wound of one of the men employed to carry Madame Montoni, and which he had received in the late affray. At night, these men, having contented themselves with securing the door of their prisoner's room, had retired from guard, and then it was that Emily, at the time of her first enquiry, had found the turret so silent and deserted. When she had attempted to open the door of the chamber, her aunt was sleeping, and this occasioned the silence which had contributed to delude her into a belief that she was no more. Yet had her terror permitted her to persevere longer in the call, she would probably have awakened Madame Montoni, and have been spared much suffering. The spectacle in the portal chamber, which afterwards confirmed Emily's horrible suspicion, was the corpse of a man who had fallen in the affray, and the same which had been borne into the servants' hall, where she took refuge from the tumult. This man had lingered under his wounds for some days, and soon after his death his body had been removed on the couch on which he died for interment in the vaults beneath the chapel, through which Emily and Bernardine had passed to the chamber. Emily, after asking Madame Montoni 1,000 questions concerning herself, left her and sought Montoni, for the more solemn interest she felt for her aunt made her now regardless of the resentment her remonstrances might draw upon herself, and of the improbability of his granting what she meant to entreat. "Madame Montoni is now dying, sir," said Emily as soon as she saw him. "Your resentment surely will not pursue her to the last moment. Suffer her to be removed from that forlorn room to her own apartment, and to have necessary comforts administered." "Of what service will that be, if she is dying?" said Montoni with apparent indifference. "The service, at least, of saving you, sir, from a few of those pangs of conscience you must suffer when you shall lie in the same situation," said Emily with imprudent indignation, of which Montoni soon made her sensible by commanding her to quit his presence. Then, forgetting her resentment, and impressed only by compassion for the piteous state of her aunt, dying without succour, she submitted to humble herself to Montoni, and to adopt every persuasive means that might induce him to relent towards his wife. For a considerable time he was proof against all she said and all she looked, but at length the divinity of pity beaming in Emily's eyes seemed to touch his heart. He turned away, ashamed of his better feelings, half sullen and half relenting, but finally consented that his wife should be removed to her own apartment and that Emily should attend her. Dreading equally that this relief might arrive too late, and that Montoni might retract his concession, Emily scarcely stayed to thank him for it, but, assisted by Annette, she quickly prepared Madame Montoni's bed, and they carried her a cordial that might enable her feeble frame to sustain the fatigue of a removal. Madame was scarcely arrived in her own apartment when an order was given by her husband that she should remain in the turret, but Emily, thankful that she had made such dispatch, hastened to inform him of it, as well as that a second removal would instantly prove fatal, and he suffered his wife to continue where she was. During this day, Emily never left Madame Montoni except to prepare such little nourishing things as she judged necessary to sustain her, and which Madame Montoni received with quiet acquiescence, though she seemed sensible that they could not save her from approaching dissolution, and scarcely appeared to wish for life. Emily, meanwhile, watched over her with the most tender solicitude, no longer seeing her imperious aunt in the poor object before her, but the sister of her late beloved father, in a situation that called for all her compassion and kindness. When night came, she determined to sit up with her aunt, but this the latter positively forbade, commanding her to retire to rest, and Annette alone to remain in her chamber. Rest was indeed necessary to Emily, whose spirits and frame were equally wearied by the occurrences and exertions of the day, but she would not leave Madame Montoni till after the turn of midnight, a period then thought so critical by the physicians. Soon after 12, having enjoined Annette to be wakeful, and to call her should any change appear for the worse, Emily sorrowfully bade Madame Montoni good night, and withdrew to her chamber. Her spirits were more than usually depressed by the piteous condition of her aunt, whose recovery she scarcely dared to expect. To her own misfortunes she saw no period, enclosed as she was in a remote castle, beyond the reach of any friends, had she possessed such, and beyond the pity even of strangers, while she knew herself to be in the power of a man capable of any action which his interest or his ambition might suggest. Occupied by melancholy reflections and by anticipations as sad, she did not retire immediately to rest, but leaned thoughtfully on her open casement. The scene before her of woods and mountains, reposing in the moonlight, formed a regretted contrast with the state of her mind, but the lonely murmur of these woods, and the view of this sleeping landscape, gradually soothed her emotions and softened her to tears. She continued to weep for some time, lost to everything but to a gentle sense of her misfortunes. When she, at length, took the handkerchief from her eyes, she perceived before her, on the terrace below, the figure she had formerly observed, which stood fixed and silent, immediately opposite to her casement. On perceiving it, she started back, and terror for some time overcame curiosity. At length she returned to the casement, and still the figure was before it, which she now compelled herself to observe, but was utterly unable to speak, as she had formerly intended. The moon shone with a clear light, and it was, perhaps, the agitation of her mind that prevented her distinguishing, with any degree of accuracy, the form before her. It was still stationary, and she began to doubt whether it was really animated. Her scattered thoughts were now so far returned as to remind her that her light exposed her to dangerous observation, and she was stepping back to remove it when she perceived the figure move, and then wave what seemed to be its arm, as if to beckon her, and while she gazed, fixed in fear, it repeated the action. She now attempted to speak, but the words died on her lips, and she went from the casement to remove her light, as she was doing which she heard from without a faint groan. Listening, but not daring to return, she presently heard it repeated. "Good God, what can this mean?" said she. Again she listened, but the sound came no more, and after a long interval of silence she recovered courage enough to go to the casement, when she again saw the same appearance. It beckoned again, and again uttered a low sound. "The groan was surely human," said she. "I will speak. Who is it," cried Emily in a faint voice, "that wanders at this late hour?" The figure raised its head, but suddenly started away and glided down the terrace. She watched it for a long time, passing swiftly in the moonlight, but heard no footstep till a sentinel from the other extremity of the rampart walked slowly along. The man stopped under her window, and, looking up, called her by name. She was retiring precipitately, but a second summons induced her to reply. The soldier then respectfully asked if she had seen anything pass. On her answering that she had, he said no more, but walked away down the terrace, Emily following him with her eyes till he was lost in the distance. But as he was on guard, she knew he could not go beyond the rampart, and therefore resolved to await his return. Soon after, his voice was heard at a distance, calling loudly, and then a voice still more distant answered, and in the next moment the watchword was given and passed along the terrace. As the soldiers moved hastily under the casement, she called to inquire what had happened, but they passed without regarding her. Emily's thoughts returning to the figure she had seen, "It cannot be a person who has designs upon the castle," said she. "Such a one would conduct himself very differently. He would not venture where sentinels were on watch, nor fix himself opposite to a window where he perceived he must be observed. Much less would he beckon or utter a sound of complaint. Yet it cannot be a prisoner, for how could he obtain the opportunity to wander thus?" If she had been subject to vanity, she might have supposed this figure to be some inhabitant of the castle who wandered under the casement in hope of seeing her, and of being allowed to declare his admiration. But this opinion never occurred to Emily, and if it had, she would have dismissed it as improbable, on considering that when the opportunity of speaking had occurred, it had been suffered to pass in silence, and that even at the moment in which she had spoken, the form had abruptly quitted the place. While she mused, 2 sentinels walked up the rampart in earnest conversation, of which she caught a few words, and learned from these that one of their comrades had fallen down senseless. Soon after, 3 other soldiers appeared, slowly advancing from the bottom of the terrace, but she heard only a low voice that came at intervals. As they drew near, she perceived this to be the voice of him who walked in the middle, apparently supported by his comrades, and she again called to them, inquiring what had happened. At the sound of her voice, they stopped and looked up while she repeated her question, and was told that Roberto, their fellow of the watch, had been seized with a fit, and that his cry, as he fell, had caused a false alarm. "Is he subject to fits?" "Yes, Signora," replied Roberto, "but if I had not, what I saw was enough to have frightened the Pope himself." "What was it?" inquired Emily, trembling. "I cannot tell what it was, lady, or what I saw, or how it vanished," replied the soldier, who seemed to shudder at the recollection. "Was it the person whom you followed down the rampart that has occasioned you this alarm?" said Emily, endeavouring to conceal her own. "Person!" exclaimed the man. "It was the devil himself, and this is not the first time I have seen him." "Nor will it be the last," observed one of his comrades, laughing. No, I warrant not," said another. "Well," rejoined Roberto, "you may be as merry now as you please. You were none so jocose the other night, Sebastian, when you was on the watch with Lancelot." "Lancelot need not talk of that," replied Sebastian. "Let him remember how he stood trembling and unable to give the word till the man was gone. If the man had not come so silently upon us, I would have seized him and soon made him tell us who he was." "What man?" inquired Emily. "It was no man, lady," said Launcelot, who stood by, "but the devil himself, as my comrade says. What man, who does not live in the castle, could get within the walls at midnight? I might just as well pretend to march to Venice, and get among all the senators when they are counselling, and I warrant I should have more chance of getting out again alive than any fellow that we should catch within the gates after dark," so I think I have proved plainly enough that this can be nobody that lives out of the castle, and now I will prove that it can be nobody that lives in the castle, for if he did, why should he be afraid to be seen? So, after this, I hope nobody will pretend to tell me it was anybody. No, I say again, by holy Pope, it was the devil, and Sebastian there knows this is not the first time we have seen him." "When did you see this figure then before?" said Emily, half smiling, who, though she thought the conversation somewhat too much, felt an interest which would not permit her to conclude it. "About a week ago, lady," said Sebastian, taking up the story. "And where?" "On the rampart, lady, higher up." "Did you pursue it, that it fled?" "No, signora. Lancelot and I were on watch together, and everything was so still you might have heard a mouse stir, when suddenly Lancelot says, 'Sebastian, do you see nothing?' I turned my head a little to the left, as it might be, thus. 'No,' says I. 'Hush,' says Lancelot, 'look yonder, just by the last cannon on the rampart.' I looked, and then thought I did see something move, but there being no light but what the stars gave, I could not be certain. We stood quite silent to watch it, and presently saw something pass along the castle wall just opposite to us." "Why did you not seize it then?" cried a soldier who had scarcely spoken till now. "Aye, why did you not seize it?" said Roberto. "You should have been there to have done that," replied Sebastian. "You would have been bold enough to have taken it by the throat, though it had been the devil himself. We could not take such a liberty, perhaps, because we are not so well acquainted with him as you are. But, as I was saying, it stole by us so quickly that we had not time to get rid of our surprise before it was gone. Then we knew it was in vain to follow. We kept constant watch all that night, but we saw it no more. Next morning we told some of our comrades, who were on duty on other parts of the ramparts, what we had seen, but they had seen nothing and laughed at us, and it was not till tonight that the same figure walked again." "Where did you lose it, friend?" said Emily to Roberto. "When I left you, lady," replied the man. "You might see me go down the rampart, but it was not till I reached the east terrace that I saw anything. Then, the moon shining bright, I saw something like a shadow flitting before me, as it were, at some distance. I stopped when I turned the corner of the east tower, where I had seen this figure not a moment before, but it was gone. As I stood, looking through the old arch which leads to the east rampart, and where I am sure it had passed, I heard all of a sudden such a sound. It was not like a groan, or a cry, or a shout, or anything I ever heard in my life. I heard it only once, and that was enough for me, for I know nothing that happened after till I found my comrades here about me." "Come," said Sebastian, "let us go to our posts. The moon is setting. Good night, lady." "Aye, let us go," rejoined Roberto. "Good night, lady." "Good night, the Holy Mother guard you," said Emily, as she closed her casement, and retired to reflect upon the strange circumstance that had just occurred, connecting which with what had happened on former nights, she endeavoured to derive from the whole something more positive than conjecture. But her imagination was inflamed, while her judgment was not enlightened, and the terror of superstition again pervaded her mind.